A mechanism via which actually you have to grant access to resources. When we talk about resource sharing or resource, let's say communication, whatever the resource is, files, simple messages to be communicated, um, accessing security barriers, let's say username and password, things like that. Whatever the resource is, since it is a digital media, we have to authenticate the user for a security reason. This authentication, it has to come after a phase of identification. Remember, this is some recap that we have to stress on. The authentication comes a step after the identification, and the identification comes after the authorization. So there is a sequential in time. There is a sequential process that have to happen in order to reach this level of authentication. We have to authorize who we have. We have who the owners or the developers or the business owners. They have to authorize the use of a given framework. After the authorization, there have to be identification of individuals or let's say users, actors, because systems they might actual the subjects they might be systems, not only human beings. Identification. After the identification comes the authentication. Identification just to say that I am Fulan, I am the person, I am the user, I have the ID, I have the username. This is the identification. But when we talk about the authentication, it is to prove your ID. To prove your ID means you've been authenticated. You are authentic to the system by proving your ID only. Mechanisms actually behind of this authentication, how to prove your ID, there are so many, they are numerous. We have to tackle them one by them. Just we have categorized here a group of them, and those are the major categories where we see authentication mechanisms in action. Means we can implement them. Those are the things that we can stress on when we design a digital solution. Digital solution means actually it can be a website or application, mobile application, desk software or system, operating system even. So all of them they can use one of those mechanisms to authenticate subjects. Subjects means users, all of them, all of the categories, human beings or systems or processes or whatever. Every each single component that needs to be authenticated, those systems they can be actually those mechanisms they can be actually utilized to authenticate. The very stressful one is the password-based authentication. The very stressful one in the sense the very actually commonly used, very spread, recognized by all developers. And the first thing to think of whenever a developer is considering to design an authentication system, so he will think of setting up a username and password based authentication mechanism, because it is in budget, it is the cheapest. In time, it is the least consuming process to authenticate users, and the least, let's say, complicated process, authentication process, that in time consuming when developing. Usually, it is the least in time consuming time. It is not it is not consuming a lot of time to whether to be developed or to be utilized for authenticating subjects or whatever. So cheap in budget, does not consume time, easy to implement. To implement, it's easy. To deploy, it's easy. And to use later on, it's easy. It means the users, at the end of the day, whenever they're trying to authenticate themselves versus a system, when they use the password-based authentication process, it's easy to use. Just prove your ID, just present your ID, and give your password. That's it. Finish. So it's not complicated enough to consider the use of a guide or something like that. Okay, but all of what with all of those positive facts, it's not the best to use. It's not the best. It is the worst even. It's not the best, and it's not in the middle, but it's the worst. Why? Because it is the easiest to break and to hack as an authentication process, as an authentication system. We discuss that, and we discuss, and still just we are going to proceed in that. So the main purpose is to discuss the mechanism behind of the authentication and processes related to the authentication. Mainly, a small recap: the authentication in general, whether it is using a password-based or any other mechanism, token-based or whatever, there are three actors. There are three actors. They are actually responsible for authenticating parties. The claimant, the one who is trying to be authenticated, the user. The verifier, the system that give you the chance to present your ID and to prove your ID, the verifier. And this verifier, to verify the claimant or to deny the claimant, he needs a relying party. He needs a database. He needs a data store. He needs an engine in background to use to stand on to whether allow or deny the access to the claimant. So three actors, they are for the authentication process. The requester, which is the claimant. The engine that rules the process of authentication. And the data store in background, which is the relying party, which is used by the engine to authenticate or to deny, to block the claimant. Both granting access or blocking from accessing, both of them, they are authentication. If we deny a user from accessing, it's an authentication. If you allow him, it's an authentication. Both of the cases, they are authentication. It was not authenticated. So this is the authentication process. It denied the user from accessing, or it denied the subject from accessing. An engine, usually when we talk about the authentication, I'm not going to explain it in details, but an engine that rules the authentication, which is actually the authentication cannot happen unless there is a registration phase. So an authentication, you have to be recognized now by the verifier. You have to be recognized. Who are you? To be recognized, you have to have credentials in prior already available in the system. So there have to be credentials credited to you, to your ID, available in the system in order to be utilized by the verifier to grant you access, to authenticate you. So authentication mechanism usually stands on a registration phase. That has to be the first scenario to happen before the authentication. The registration has to happen before the authentication. Usually registration happens once, only one time, that's it. But authentication, whenever the user tries to use the system again and again and again and again, he only authenticates versus the system. He does not re-register again. No, only authenticates his credentials versus the system. That's it. Rules that you have to memorize. Usually I'll stop at this level unless they come. Did they come or not? No, still ما حد. Subhanallah. Regardless, so the users, they have to be either they do know something, or they possess something, or they are something, or they do something. If they are capable to go through one of those channels, so they are able to be authenticated. Usually the authentication mechanism, whatever the solution is ruling the authentication, that rules the authentication, the subjects have to either know something, or to have to possess something, or they have to act to be something, not to act to be something, or to act here to do something. One of them is enough. More than one, yeah, it depends of the level of the complexity, but usually one is required. Only one authentication mechanism is required for a system. true false question that that I can give it to you in the final or in the next mid. Can we the answer is, the question says, can we implement an authentication system in a given solution or a given web solution, for example, where the authentication mechanism has to recognize that the user is something and the user does something and the user possesses something and the user knows something. الأربعة. Here the answer yes, we can, absolutely we can, because we are going to implement the first layer where to authenticate the users based on the knowledge. Second layer to implement an authentication layer where the users possess something. A third interface to authenticate users where the users they are something. A fourth interface to authenticate users again where the users do something. Absolutely, and the system will run later on. We can do that. The possibility of yes, can we? Yes, we can. Yet, is it the best thing to do? No, it's not the best. It's not the best option. We have to go only beyond one authentication mechanism. We have to strengthen it, and that's it. Because it is a time waste and it is time consuming process. If we are going to authenticate the users 4 times, why it is needed? If there is a need, maybe. Otherwise, no. Only one mechanism is enough. I'll stop here.